A warm welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Noah Mayhew. I'm a research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar with Dr. Elisabeth Röhrlich from the University of Vienna. Dr. Röhrlich is associate professor in the Department of History. She has worked on a number of topics, but today we are going to discuss the International Atomic Energy Agency. Her work on the history of the IAEA has appeared in various journals, such as Diplomacy and Statecraft, the Journal of Cold War Studies, Cold War History, and the IAEA's own bulletin. Dr. Röhrlich has also run a project at the University of Vienna that's an oral history of the IAEA, which I certainly recommend you take a look at. But today, we are going to discuss her recent book, Inspectors for Peace, A History of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. I have had the pleasure of reading Dr. Röhrlich's book myself. In my humble view, it's a masterpiece and certainly has a place in the pantheon of seminal accounts, historical accounts of the development of the IAEA. And if I do say so myself, Dr. Röhrlich's book benefited from extensive archival research that allowed her to put the story of the evolution of the IAEA into the context of human stories, of the people who were actually calling the shots and making the decisions, as well as into the historical context. Through a focus on the dual mandate of the agency, promotional versus safeguards and security safeguards chiefly, through a view to the balance of technical and political issues that the IAEA is placed within, and the concept of this spirit of Vienna, I will say that Dr. Röhrlich's book has coded the genome of the IAEA. So I hope I've talked up the book enough. I encourage you to give it a shot, and we'll hear from Dr. Röhrlich about the book in just a moment. But before we head into the actual conduct of the webinar, a few housekeeping things. First of all, for those of you joining us on Zoom, please enter any questions you may have in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screens. For those of you joining us on YouTube, you are welcome to send us questions to an email address, events@vcdnp.org. Please note that we are recording this webinar, and if you have any further questions, please, again, feel free to send them to events@vcdnp.org. On that note, I'm very happy, Dr. Röhrlich, to hand you the floor, and I can't wait to see your presentation.
Thank you very much, Noah. The introduction was really too kind. Thank you. And thank you to the VCDNP for always being so interested in my work, which is really flattering for an old school diplomatic historian like me. Let me quickly share my presentation. Yeah, I think you should be able to see it now. Is that correct? Can you give me a thumbs up? Excellent. So as Noah already mentioned, I'm going to present my book, Inspectors for Peace, A History of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was published about a year ago in spring 2022. Time flies, with Johns Hopkins University Press. And I'm really honored that the book was published in a wonderful series, the Nuclear History and Contemporary Affairs series, which was edited by the late Marty Sherwin. And it features some great books on nuclear history, including, for instance, Mariana Bujarin's Inheriting the Bomb book about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine. My book is an institutional history of the International Atomic Energy Agency, from the first attempts to create a global nuclear authority, which began in the second half of the 1940s, to the more recent past. But my book mostly focuses on the time of the Cold War. And as Noah also already indicated, it focuses particularly on the IAEA's dual mandate of promotion and control. So in light of the serious crisis of the present day, why should we care about the IAEA's past? The IAEA is dealing with some of the most crucial issues in international security. Since the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, the IAEA has been trying to ensure the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. The IAEA is also confronted with the growing nuclear program in Iran. So why history? And I brought you today a familiar picture that is the Vienna International Center, which houses the IAEA. And if you look at the vertical structuring of the IAEA's office space, this already seems to suggest that history does not rank that high. The archives are located on the 4th floor, that is the lowest floor of agency offices, while the Director General resides at the very top of the building. In my book, I try to show that history is crucial in understanding the agency's current role in international security. The foundations of today's nuclear order and today's safeguard system were laid at certain moments in time, and this historical context impacted the agency's legal foundations. So I try to explain why the agency's founders created the agency in the first place in the mid-1950s, how the agency's dual mandate evolved over time, and what history reveals about the agency's limits as well as its potentials. So follow me into the IAEA archives. You can see me here in the IAEA archives reading room with my colleague and fellow nuclear historian, Dr. Kapil Patil. And it's always nice to meet colleagues in the IAEA archives, which now really has a state-of-the-art reading room. But that was not the case when I began researching the IAEA's history about 10 years ago. Originally, the IAEA archives were mostly designed for internal use, and they were not really equipped to house a number of outside researchers doing writing history books or articles. So this has changed a lot over the past 10 years, and especially since around 2016, when the IAEA celebrated its 60th anniversary. After that, more and more records groups were declassified. This was also the result of, I think, growing pressure and interest from historians around the world. So these archives really are a treasure trove for historians, and they have a fantastic team. I want to highlight that they're really very supportive and knowledgeable, and I could not have done the work without the IAEA archives and its archivists. In addition to the IAEA archives, I also used I also visited other archives in several countries around the world, but the bulk of my archival sources came from the IAEA. I also conducted some oral history interviews, including, for instance, former Director Generals Mohammed El-Baradei and Hans Blix. Today, I would like to share with you some of my findings on the IAEA's early history, and particularly on the early evolution of IAEA safeguards. The creation of the IAEA was first proposed by US President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his famous Atoms for Peace speech in December 1953 before the United Nations General Assembly. And you see a picture of Eisenhower giving that speech on the right of this slide. Only 4 years later, the IAEA opened its headquarters in Vienna in 1957. So this really was a rather fast process of building a newly organization from scratch. Vienna at the time was not yet the site of major international organizations. In fact, the establishment of the IAEA only initiated this later development. I think it's also important to recall that this time of the IAEA's creation, the years from 1953 to 1957, were a rather tense phase of the Cold War. That was the time of the Suez Crisis, the Hungarian uprising, the launch of Sputnik. And yet, the two Cold War rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union, cooperated quite successfully in the creation of the agency. Again, I think this is striking, especially since this was a field as sensitive and competitive as nuclear energy. While the cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States was businesslike, the negotiations to set up the agency and to draft its statute was shaped by controversies, especially between the so-called nuclear haves, especially the uranium producers, and the so-called nuclear have-nots, the future recipients of IAEA technical assistance. And I brought you a headline from a newspaper from the year 1956, the headline of an article that was covering the negotiations on the IAEA statute. And the headline said, "Atoms for Peace plan torn by rival blocs." If you read the article, you will see the rival blocs were not the Soviet Union and the United States, but the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. And particularly, or at the heart of this debate were India and South Africa. So from the beginnings of the IAEA, it was not just a story about the East and the West, the Cold War, but also about North-South tensions. Since the IAEA's inception, the IAEA had its dual mandate of promotion of access to nuclear technologies and science without furthering its military uses. And the IAEA's founders introduced the concept of nuclear safeguards to make sure that technical assistance was used only for civilian projects. And at these safeguards, or the beginnings of safeguards, I would like to look on the next few slides. The foundations of IAEA safeguards were crafted long before the IAEA came to verify the safeguards obligations of the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which entered into force in 1970. For the first few years of the agency's history, safeguards existed mostly on paper, though. During the 1950s and 60s, the age of decolonization, the newly independent states associated inspections on their territory with what they had just overcome, great power imperialism. And while the so-called developing states saw safeguards as discriminatory, many industrialized states feared that the agency's inspections would lead to industrial espionage and also to a lot of work, for instance, in terms of record keeping. Again, we see continuities from these early days to today. So safeguards began as a rather small division with only a few staff members, and they were also housed in the less desirable parts of the IAEA's first headquarters. So again, the architecture or the structure of the building can tell us something about how the relevance of certain offices or parts of the agency were perceived. The IAEA's first headquarters, by the way, was located in the former Grand Hotel at the Ringstraße. Today, it is again the Grand Hotel, and you can see a picture on the right side of the slide. Also, before the entry of the NPT, agency safeguards only verified that recipients of technical nuclear assistance did not use specified items of foreign aid for military activities. And in some cases, they also verified nuclear activities of states that had placed them voluntary under IAEA safeguards. On the left, you see a picture of the first IAEA safeguards routine inspection at the research reactor here in Austria in Seibersdorf. That was in 1966. The role of safeguards was controversial in these early years, even within the Secretariat. Technical assistance and not safeguards was seen as the IAEA selling point. And Eisenhower had, in fact, not mentioned the notion of safeguards in his Atoms for Peace speech. Like other institutions in the UN system, the IAEA, the newly founded IAEA, tried to find a new logo for itself. And I would like to share with you one of these early logo designs, because I think it's quite telling. It tells you something about how people at the time perceived the agency or what they expected for the new agency. This logo here was a suggestion by the IAEA's first Director General, William Sterling Cole. You can see him on the right-hand side, and he was the head of the agency from 1957 to 1961. As we all know, he did not succeed with this design for the IAEA's logo, but again, it's interesting to look at it. You see on the top of the logo, the peace staff. So there was obviously some expectation that the IAEA would receive a role in international peace. But you see more detail on the IAEA's future role in science, medicine, power generation, and agriculture. And apart from the peace staff, even if it's placed quite prominently on the top, there is no specific hint to the IAEA's work in non-proliferation or safeguards. The slow beginnings of safeguards did not mean that the agency's founders were not aware of the threat of nuclear weapons proliferation. And I brought you here a little glimpse into these early discussions. This here is an example from 1955, from discussions about the new IAEA at the US State Department, and the question on how to address the proliferation problem or the proliferation potential of civilian nuclear cooperation. And I think this quote, and I will read it in a minute or even less than a minute, in a few seconds, I think it demonstrates that at the time, the core goal of the later NPT, that is to freeze the number of existing nuclear weapon states in a universal agreement on peaceful nuclear systems, was already on the list of potential ideas that were discussed. It says, can we really support a policy which in effect freezes the present nuclear weapons production pattern and thus denies to most countries the right to manufacture them while we and a few others continue to make weapons, or at least to maintain current stocks? And then in handwritten notes, another State Department member answered on the same paper. You can see that on the very right of the slide. We can't deny them, but we can refuse to help them if they want to build weapons. So this was a time of intensive political thinking on key questions of a future nuclear order. And this reminds us that gaps in the early safeguard system to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation were not the result of a lack of awareness, but the result of political negotiations and compromises that had to be made. So the negotiators had to ask themselves, what is politically possible? What's technically feasible? and what's legally possible in terms of international law. The entanglement of political and technical issues made it vital for the IAEA's bureaucratic arm to cultivate the image as a technical servant to the agency's member states. And since the IAEA's beginnings, the agency has prided itself on being a scientific, technical organization, not a political one. But especially during the Cold War, it was really difficult to manage this distinction between politics and on the one hand and science and technology on the other. And the contested boundaries between perceptions of the political versus the technical, scientific, became clear already in 1958 when the IAEA Board of Governors decided to establish the Scientific Advisory Committee, SAC. And you can see a picture from one of the first meetings in 1958. And I'm going to talk a bit about that picture in a moment. So to create a Scientific Advisory Committee for the agency seemed to be a no-brainer. It would be good to have the expertise of the best and brightest experts in the field with the new atomic agency. But in fact, to set up that committee caused very controversial discussions. They were supposed to focus on scientific and technical aspects, but as both the Secretariat and several board members acknowledged, there was no such thing as a purely technical question in things as nuclear safeguards. So while it was expected that SAC would increase the IAEA's scientific prestige and authority, especially Western diplomats foresaw difficulties because they thought that SAC could develop too much influence over the agency and possibly evoke a conflict of competence with the Board of Governors when it touched upon political issues. And when you look at the picture and the people who were members of SAC, you, for instance, see Isidor Rabi on the left, and in the middle and back, you see Vasily Emelianov and Homi Bhabha. So these were, of course, some of the most prominent nuclear scientists at the time, but they were also members of the Board of Governors. So this shows how obviously it was important to show that there were scientific parts and political parts of the agency's work, and that they were supposed to be distinct, but at the same time that this separation was somewhat artificial. Before I conclude, let me quickly jump forward to the IAEA's new role under the NPT, which entered into force in 1970. At the IAEA, the most important venue for discussions on the future role of the IAEA under the NPT was the so-called Safeguards Committee, which convened from summer 1970 to spring 1971. And this Safeguards Committee laid out the principles to shape safeguards activities and cultures for decades to come. This committee was open to all IAEA member states, so not just to states that actually had signed the NPT or were planning to sign and ratify it. It's also important to recall that the IAEA, despite its important verification role under the NPT, was not involved in the drafting of the NPT. It was not even officially informed on all the steps that led to the final draft treaty. Only once the treaty had entered into force, the IAEA came to play an official role and established the Safeguards Committee. The results of the Safeguards Committee were published in 1972 as INFCIRC 153, familiar name still today, as the acronym is still used for NPT-style safeguards agreements, which flowed from these guidelines. The new comprehensive safeguards that were developed in the Safeguards Committee represented a major extension of the IAEA's traditional safeguards system, which, as I mentioned earlier, were previously mandatory only for recipients of technical assistance and only applied to specified facilities. I referred to the IAEA archives before, and the records of the Safeguards Committee as one of these great findings from the archive. They were only declassified, I think, in 2016, more or less around that time. And when you look at these records, you can see what people were expecting from new IAEA safeguards. What were they intended to accomplish? Because according to Article 3 of the MPT, the IAEA should exercise safeguards measures, I quote, with a view to preventing diversion of nuclear energy from peaceful uses to nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. But the Safeguards Committee acknowledged that safeguards would not be able to prevent the potential diversion of nuclear materials from civilian to military uses. They could only hope to detect such a diversion and thereby deter. So INFCIRC 153 contained a somewhat watered down version of the MPT's overall non-proliferation goal. The IAEA was not able to actually prevent, but it hoped that the risk of detection would deter states from diverting nuclear materials. So these were just a few spotlights on the IAEA's early history and the early evolution of safeguards. I think that it can be insightful to understand these past patterns, such as the competition between promotion and inhibiting functions of the agencies, or the political and technical / scientific divide. And I think institutional memory can be an important resource also for current debates. So thank you for your attention. I hope you might consider even reading the book, but I definitely look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Elisabeth, for a fantastic presentation of a fantastic book. I will remind participants before we jump into the Q&A that any questions you may have can be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. For those of you following us on YouTube, you can also submit your questions to events@vcdnp.org, and one of our colleagues will put them into the Q&A function in the webinar. I'm going to abuse my my place as the moderator of the session to go ahead and ask you one question while others are thinking. And you alluded to this a little bit in your presentation. Early in the book, you talk about the spirit of Vienna, this idea of cooperation and compromise being paramount in the negotiations here in Vienna. And this later sort of grew to be almost a proverb, right? A legend of the spirit of Vienna. But you also say in the book that it was quite rare in the early days. You alluded to these very hectic early meetings of the board that could turn into, as I think you put it in the book, a house divided. Later, you attribute this idea of the spirit of Vienna as a result of superpower competition. So the question is, as we see these tensions playing out today, both in the board and the broader geopolitical context, can you reflect on this idea of the spirit of Vienna? Where did it come from? Did we ever have it? And if so, where did it go? And based on your research, where is it that you think we're heading?
Thank you, Noah. Yes, I'm glad to talk about that, especially since I really believe that international organizations are not detached from the place where they are located. So I'm happy as a historian who lives and works in Austria to also talk a little bit about the place where all this happened. Yeah, the notion of the spirit of Vienna, I think, developed a life of its own over the years. There is this official, or at least commissioned, history of the IAEA by David Fisher. For those of you who don't know it, you can find it online as a PDF, so it's really accessible for everyone. He has a whole chapter about the spirit of Vienna, and he says, since the 1960s, people refer to that. And I think the notion meant a few things, some different things, but they also related, were also related to each other. It was this place, neutral Austria, which presented itself as a bridge builder, a meeting place for the world. The IAEA was smaller in terms of people who worked there. There was no rotating job system, so people knew each other, the families knew each other. Yeah, but I think the notion really came up in the context of the Kennedy-Khrushchev summit in 1961. But even for that summit, this positive connotation of the spirit of Vienna does not work, because that was mostly a failed summit. But anyway, that was the time when this notion became popular, I think. And I was struck by the romanticization that there is about the spirit of Vienna, was my impression when talking to people in the IAEA environment, especially older ones who had built their career there, saying that was the time of the spirit of Vienna, with all these positive attributes that are mentioned. Probably another one being that there was more overlap, in fact, between political and scientific personnel. So on the board, there were more people who had also a specific technical or scientific expertise. So knowing about this, I call it now romanticization of the spirit of Vienna, and how Fisher's writes about the spirit of Vienna, I looked back into the history and the sources from the 1950s and 60s. And of course, there were times when there was good cooperation, but there were really tough fights. And already in the late 50s, it was the first time that the Soviet Union threatened to leave the IAEA and said we needed, like a dog needs a fifth leg. So I think the story is too easy, and that's why I have these little remarks about the spirit of Vienna. I think in this, that's the last thing I'm going to say about that, but I think it began to fade, at least that's how, for instance, David Fisher describes it in the second half of the 1970s. But then again, Fisher attributes this to the growth of the influence of the Group of 77 in the IAEA, which threatened South Africa's influence in the IAEA, and Fisher was a South African in the IAEA. So this is only one part of the story. But yeah, I hope this was not too confusing.
No, it's always interesting to hear the way these things play out. And funny you should mention David Fisher's history. It's one that I've turned to myself quite a few times. And he wrote the history while as a diplomat in residence at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, almost from memory, and then later had to go back and find references for it. So it's a pleasure indeed. Second, of course, only to your brothers. Interesting that you should mention this political technical balance in that answer as well. The Scientific Advisory Council and board members interacting or overlapping quite so much. We have a question from Bashir Azam, who is a friend of the center. Hi, Bashir. He's currently reading the book. He finds it original and very informative and sends his congratulations. He's also asking, because you touched on managing the boundaries between politics and science, making reference to, as recently as last month, many member states still exchange accusations of politicization on the premise that the IAEA is a technical organization. So he's asking, do you think that politicization has been a serious issue at the IAEA throughout its history? And can you give a standout example? And just sort of adding on to Bashir's question, I will also note that in your book, you note at one point that even accusing another member state of politicizing becomes a political act, sort of this myth of politicization that you talk about. So what do you think about all of that?
So first of all, thank you for the kind words on the book. I really appreciate it. It's interesting that you asked the question about the politicization right after the question about the spirit of Vienna, because to me, there are similar developments in place or in progress. So this, just like the spirit of Vienna, the notion of increased politicization at the IAEA has developed a life of its own, I think. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. I will talk about this in more detail in a moment. But it has become a buzzword saying, oh, there's politicization going on. And I think it hints to problems that are really there. But what I don't like about the notion of the politicization is that the word itself implies that the IAEA in reality is a purely technical and scientific organization, and it suddenly brings politics in this neutral technical organization. And I think this is really too simple. And often it is, or the accusation you just mentioned, that to say this is politicization is mostly a synonym for saying this is an opinion I don't share. Interestingly enough, this is not just what I came up with as a historian, but this is an observation that diplomats shared with me, and I agree. And we have similar patterns right from the start of the agency. The Scientific Advisory Committee is one example where, to elaborate a little bit more on that example that I showed about the Scientific Advisories Committee's establishment, that, some states said, so this is just a technical organization, or that's its main job. Let's not fall back to Cold War patterns. We focus on science and technology. And then the other country said, well, this is all political. Safeguards is political. So to me, looking at the sources over the years, the continuities in this kind of rhetorical pattern seemed more relevant than the changes. On the other hand, of course, I mentioned that earlier, there are more people with a political background on the board in the more recent past than in these early years, where you have the most eminent nuclear physicists of the time. But frankly, the IAEA also has to deal with much more politically complex and dangerous and difficult tasks than it had in the early years. I mean, it really began in the early 1980s after the Osirak attack. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this cover for my book. One is that I think it's so nice to have this outfit with the trench coat and the glasses, because it gives this image of the bureaucrat inspector that characterized the agency for so long, but also because this shift in leadership exactly marks this change in the IAEA's role in international affairs. Eklund, as a nuclear physicist, focusing on the IAEA's scientific and technical development, and then Blix takes over, a former politician, a trained diplomat. So I think you cannot really avoid the politicization if you have to deal with things like Russia's war on Ukraine. The IAEA has so many important political tasks. Yeah, but again, still it has to manage this sort of artificial division, which is important for its legitimacy in international affairs. But I'm a historian. Please try not to force me to talk too much about the present day. I prefer to stay in the past.
Well, for those of you on the line who don't know, Eklund, who Elisabeth was referred to, is Sigvard Eklund, who was the second Director General and was, if I'm remembering your line in the book correctly, Elisabeth, was famously tone deaf to all of the political issues that were put on his desk. He's a very technically minded man. But don't let me put words in your mouth. So on that note, going back to the past, we have a question from Alfred Maya, somewhat controversial, but I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Alfred is asking if you found any evidence that Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech and the concept of the IAEA had the underlying purpose, Alfred asks, to put a smiley face on the nuclear enterprise in order to enable support for the infrastructure needed for nuclear weapons production. Be interested to hear about your thoughts on that.
Yes, great question. I was actually concerned about my brief presentation of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace because I really glossed over these multiple aims that the US administration had with Eisenhower, the aims that it had with creating the IAEA. So definitely that was an initiative to sell nuclear energy to the world, make people excited about nuclear energy, distract from the buildup of nuclear weapons, because Eisenhower is not just the Atoms for Peace man. He's also the New Look man with a military doctrine that relies heavily on nuclear weapons. And as this is the Cold War, there's also competition going on between the Soviet Union and the Americans on the hearts and minds of the so-called developing countries. So they both have to present themselves as being the state that is willing to share this new technology with the world. So if you are interested in that aspect of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace plan, there's kind of propaganda aspect behind it. I really recommend also a rather recent book on the IAEA's history, or not just the IAEA's history, more on American peaceful nuclear cooperation by Jacob Darwin Hamblin. It's called The Wedged Atom. There's only one issue I have with this perspective. I mean, I fully agree that the United States used this Atoms for Peace initiative to sell atomic energy as a great new invention to the world and to distract from nuclear weapons. But this view is so US-centric, and it ignores that many states in the world were really interested in receiving access to what was perceived as the new technology of the future. And this perspective, this was the result of US propaganda, denies the agency of the countries that were really interested in getting access to nuclear technology.
Indeed. I mean, you know, I absolutely agree with you that it's difficult to ascribe one sort of motivation to it, but there certainly were many. We have another question from William Burr, who thanks you for a fantastic talk. He's asking, in terms of the agency's history during the last century, the 20th century, what are the big unknowns? What issues and events are still obscure because records are either closed or inaccessible? And I'll tack on to that. You mentioned a little bit your experience working with the archives during your initial remarks, but I am also a patron of the archives. And so I feel compelled to ask you what your experience was with what documents were unavailable that you wish you had been able to get to, and sort of what are the politics of that?
Hi, Bill. Great you could join us. Bill is, for those of you who don't know him, he has such an encyclopedic knowledge of sources and records on the nuclear age. And right from the beginning, my first day in Washington, DC, when I tried to access archival records in the US, he has been so helpful. So shout out to you, Bill. And of course, it's not surprising that you ask about accessibility and sources. About the question, what's still obscure, interestingly enough, I think in some regards, it gets even better the closer you get to the present day, which is somewhat counterintuitive, because you would think there are these archival policies that you will only have access to records 20 or 30 years after they have been created, or after the people who are mentioned in it passed away. But the more the IAEA got involved into this highly political international crisis, the more it also had to be transparent in some regards. So in the Iran case, I think early on, board reports were published, which never happened in other instances before. The crucial thing to me is safeguards. So everything that is classified as safeguards confidential, you won't get it at the archives, and probably there's reason for it, right? These are ongoing country cases. I don't know, but this is something that I would be really interested in to see. For instance, the story I opened the book with is about how do I put it in a few words? So I opened the book with a story that Dimitri Perikos, a former IAEA inspector who passed away sadly a few years ago, told me. And he said, did you know the IAEA had safeguards on the ground when India tested its so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, the Smiling Buddha, in 1974. And I said, no, tell me the story. And he said, yes, I was one of them. I was a very junior inspector. We were on a routine inspection. And of course, we couldn't do anything. It was not part of our mandate. But I was really interested in following this story, because even though the IAEA could not act right away because it had just because it had inspectors on the ground, I was curious to see how did they react, what were the reports from the inspectors to the IAEA, how was this case debated at headquarters. But the moment you want to dive into these very sensitive discussions, there is really no way to get access. Maybe it changes over time. We will see. So to me, safeguards confidential records would be what I would be interested in seeing.
I can absolutely join you and say that I would also love to see safeguard confidential documents, but it's my understanding that one of the reasons that the agency gets the trust that it does from member states is that nobody, not even other member states, gets access to that stuff. So
yeah, and that's actually a theme that I have throughout the book, that some of the things where you would say, this is really bad about the agency, or that is a gap in the agency system, that, or in our case, it's really too bad we can't access these records, or it's too bad the IAEA could not use intelligence information earlier. There were reasons to these decisions that was not just pure oversight. It was a reason to ensure a broad membership. And this is something positive in and of itself.
Indeed. The member states' trust in the agency as paramount. And my recollection, it's not so much that they couldn't use intelligence information, they didn't, perhaps for that same reason. But anyway, that's an aside. I'll move back to something that you were talking about a little bit earlier, and that is the NPT negotiations and the IAEA's absence in that process. Valeria Hesse, who is with Open Nuclear Network here in Vienna, is asking, why is it exactly that the agency was not involved in the drafting of the NPT? And she's wondering, would the treaty have benefited in some way from the IAEA's technical presence during this process? And sort of wondering on your reflections on how the IAEA's role has changed in the NPT review process over time through different review conferences.
Hi, Valeria. Also a familiar face, even though I can't see your face, but I'm glad you could join us. Yeah, great question. Or questions. Why was the IAEA not involved in the treaty? On the outside, Eklund, we mentioned him earlier, the IAEA Director General at the time, presented himself as being mad about that. Said, well, I don't know what's going on in Geneva in the 18-nation disarmament committee discussions, and I'm not even regularly informed. And on the other hand, the IAEA also highlighted that it should not be involved. And I think rightly so, because for several reasons. So the IAEA was not seen as an agency that has a nuclear non-proliferation mission. It was an organization with a dual mandate of promotion and control. And with the NPT, the international community provided the IAEA with the mandate to execute safeguards to verify that one article of the NPT. Not all articles, not the disarmament article, but the safeguards article. So I think that was in line what people thought about the agency. Do you hear me again? Okay. And despite Eklund's announcement, which sounded rather grumpy that he was not informed, also what was in the agency's sense. Of course, they were informed by governors and people who attended the Geneva meetings. And this distinction between the NPT and the IAEA was very important because at the time we did not have this almost universal membership of the NPT, and many quite influential IAEA member states had no intention, and said so, to sign the NPT. So it was important to make clear that the IAEA will just receive a mandate, but it is not a non-proliferation agency. And that brings me to your second question about how the IAEA's relationship to the NPT changed over time. The NPT itself already had a slight impact on the balance of the IAEA's dual mandate of promotion of control. Because in the beginning, how it was interpreted, it was mostly about promotion, and the control was just an extra. And with the NPT, the control or verification aspect became more important. And over the years, following the NPT, when you look at the evolution of the technical assistance guidelines, for example, you see that the IAEA's work became closer to the NPT. It was more willing to identify itself with the NPT. And I have the example in the book. I don't recall the year. I think it was 2016, 17, something like that, that the IAEA bulletin had a cover saying IAEA safeguards preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. And that was, I would say, unthinkable in the 1970s, when the IAEA still tried to show we are not just the NPT.
It's definitely very interesting how sort of organizational identity changes over time. Definitely very interesting. So we've got a few minutes left, and I'm going to proceed with the next question from Bruce Dario. Given all of, I know you said you wanted to stay in the past, but let's prognosticate for a moment. Given all of the history of the IAEA, given the cases of proliferation that the agency has had to deal with in the past, how would you think the role of the IAEA might change or evolve in a world where there's further nuclear proliferation that we don't have cases of today?
So prognostication is even worse than talking about the present for a nuclear historian. How do I put it? There are different ways to look at it, but one aspect that we have not touched that much in our conversation here today is that of leadership. And I think it will also depend a lot on who is at the top of the agency. Because if you look at the different styles of leadership over the years, you see really differences in how the IAEA presents itself, and specifically how it positions itself in these major crisis situations. And this, I was talking about outfits earlier, and this might look like a superficial remark, but that was how the IAEA leadership presented itself during the Cold War. And now you have Director General Rafael Grossi going to the field wearing an IAEA sport jacket, not afraid to go to the front lines, not doing his job from the office. I'm not saying that the previous ones were just doing their job from the office. Don't get me wrong. I'm particularly a big fan of Hans Blix, but the style, the way the IAEA positioned itself in international affairs, I think also depends a lot on the leadership at the head of the agency.
I think that's very, very well put, particularly considering everything that's going on in the geopolitical context. I'll ask you one final question, and you're welcome to give any concluding remarks that you so desire. And final question comes from me. If you absolutely had to nail down the biggest lesson, the biggest takeaway from your book for our audience today, what would that takeaway be? And then following that answer, please feel free to give any further reflections you wish, and then we'll close out the webinar.
Biggest lesson. It might sound boring, but I think it is not. I think it's important to understand why we're complaining about gaps in the IAEA system, certain authorities the IAEA does not have, things that the IAEA missed, but there are reasons for it. And throughout the history, it usually was not the lack of awareness. Sometimes you can read texts about, for instance, the IAEA in Iraq, and it's a story that goes somewhat like, well, the IAEA missed everything in Iraq. They were so complacent. They only looked at what they were supposed to look at. Why did inspectors not look at other things? And then with the proliferation crisis of the early 1990s, Iraq, South Africa, North Korea, the IAEA finally woke up and was able to address these things. And then we had the additional protocol. But when looking back at the history, you see that all these risks and dangers, it was crystal clear. People understood there were these risks. They knew that it was not enough they were allowed to look at. But that was the political mandate. That was what put an international law. So I think this is really important. If we see a gap and we want to address this, if we want to strengthen the IAEA in a certain field, we need to understand why this weakness is there, because it is often not as simple as it might seem. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it here.
Not as simple as it might seem. I think that's as good a point to move to end on as any. Dr. Elisabeth Röhrlich, we thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fascinating foray into your book. One more plug: Inspectors for Peace. There is a link to it in the chat. Dr. Röhrlich, thank you so much, and thanks to all who typed in, who joined us today.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, VCDNP. Thank you, audience. It was really great. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.